Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar called Getting to Visual Studio May Be Easier Than You Think. My name is Rachel Gibson, and I am the Sales and Marketing Director at Synergex, and I'll be your host. I'm going to introduce the speakers. Dan Ellis is an architect on our professional services team, and he has many years of experience helping Synergex customers move their technology forward. He's helped many customers get to Visual Studio, and he's excited to share some of his insights from those engagements. We also have Tim Bauguess, who was recently promoted to Director of Software Development. Congrats to Tim. Prior to that, Tim was a development manager on our development team. In particular, his focus was the Visual Studio integration, where he led efforts to continually improve the developer experience. Tim will start the webinar off with some information about why we recommend Visual Studio for Synergy development, and he'll return at the end to provide an SDA product update. Now I will turn things over to Tim, and we will see you all at the end of the session.
Hi, Tim Bauguess here. I'll be going over the agenda today. So we're going to start off with why you'd want to move to Visual Studio. And from there, we'll move into the details about what moving to Visual Studio will look like, including prerequisites and considerations, some things to know, the process, and common issues. As a follow-up, we'll do some customer examples and even take a look at a case study. And then we'll jump into an SDI product update. At the very ending, we'll go through some Q&A. All right, let's jump in. So why Visual Studio? Number one, it's industry standard. So you can look here at the Stack Overflow survey, and you will see that according to their 2023 results, Visual Studio remains one of the top 2 used IDEs by professional developers worldwide. So while VS Code leads in popularity at 78%, Visual Studio still holds a significant 28% share, showcasing its continued relevance and strength in the development community. So it's important to note the distinction between VS Code and Visual Studio. While VS Code is a powerful and versatile code editor, Visual Studio is a comprehensive integrated development environment. So it's more of a full-fledged IDE. The depth of features and integrations in Visual Studio is, I think, unparalleled. In VS Code, we do offer an extension with basic colorization support for Synergy DBL. I think of it as a step up from something like Notepad++, which you'll actually see here as number 4 as well. They have a mix of more full IDEs with editors that can have extensions. It enhances readability, but it doesn't dive deep into the integrations. On the other hand, in Visual Studio, we have gone all out. We offer full language feature support, ensuring developers have all the tools they need for a seamless coding experience. We also have a deep integration. So the deep integration capabilities are the strength, really, of coming to Visual Studio here. This means developers can write, they can debug, they can test, and deploy, all from one environment. Our Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio support taps into this potential, offering features that are tailor-made for Synergy development. If you want to see more of these details for the industry trends, feel free to click on that link below the image. So why else? Microsoft had a good quote on their doc site. Have you ever wished you could go back to a previously working version of your code? Do you find yourself storing copies of your code in different locations as a backup? Well, version control is the answer. Git is the most widely used modern version control system. With Git, you can track the code changes you make over time, and you can revert to specific versions. So whether you're a professional developer or if you're learning to code, Visual Studio's Git experience can be very useful to you. The Git integration is seamless, so seamless source control is essential. Visual Studio offers integrated Git support, making version control and collaboration easier than ever. Using Visual Studio, you can authenticate to your remote Git repository through a service like GitHub or Azure DevOps. You can view all the files you check out directly in Visual Studio through the Solution Explorer. You can follow a best practice Git branching flow to enable your team working on multiple features at the same time using Visual Studio to intuitively create, sync, and merge new branches. As seen in the image, Visual Studio can give you a view of all the details of your repository to manage exactly as you need. Microsoft's Visual Studio team is also constantly adding new improvements, including performance improvements for Git operations through Git Graph and solution load during branch switching. So I think about 80% of the time they've now reduced from requiring a new solution load. All right, why else? It's feature rich. We're going to go into quite a few different areas now. So this includes something like MS Build, starting off, which is a powerful and flexible build platform for Visual Studio. It orchestrates the process of turning source files into outputs, be it executables, libraries, or data files. You can also execute what you configure in Visual Studio using MS Build through the command line, enabling something like continuous integration through pipelines as well. One of the biggest strengths of MS Build is really its extensibility. Developers can define projects with custom tasks, use conditionals, and even control the build process's flow, ensuring it fits within specific requirements. We've developed custom targets that cater to Synergy project types, including traditional, .NET, scripts, and repository. We have also added support for multiple mainline projects that enable you to quickly migrate all of your existing DBRs to a single project in Visual Studio, instead of configuring many projects for each DBR. MS Build provides a better way to manage your environment through common properties or environment variables instead of just using the synergy.ini. So there's quite a lot of opportunity here, and the MS Build project structure and build structure really helps streamline everything. Another big advantage here is the .NET support. We have language support now for .NET, which is also deeply integrated within Visual Studio. This provides a rich set of libraries and tools, allowing developers to create robust, scalable, and efficient applications that work with Synergy.net, even on Linux, so even cross-platform. So you can build on Windows and deploy and publish to Linux, for example. For IntelliSense, it's really a developer's best friend. IntelliSense offers real-time code completion, helping developers write code faster and with fewer errors. It provides suggestions and insights based on the context, also significantly reducing the chance of typos and bugs. Auto formatting sort of in the same line here, where it just helps you maintain clean and consistent code with minimal effort, whether you're using an editor config file that automatically gets picked up into Visual Studio or our tools options. Visual Studio's auto formatting feature automatically aligns and organizes code according to best practices that you can also set, ensuring that your team adheres to consistent coding standards. For unit testing, it really helps ensure the reliability and robustness of your code. We have integrated unit testing tools for both traditional and .NET, where developers can easily write and run tests, making certain that each unit of their code performs exactly as expected. This not only boosts code quality, but overall will reduce your debugging time. Speaking of the debugger, Visual Studio provides one of the most advanced debugging environments available. It allows developers to set breakpoints, watch variables, inspect the call stack, and interactively step through the code, all in a user-friendly interface. I'll show you a screenshot of that in the next slide. And then code navigation. With Visual Studio, you can quickly navigate code by jumping to specific methods, classes, or files using the go-to functionality. So you can go to file, you can go to definition, you can find all references for a symbol in one of your files. There's also like IntelliSense member list dropdowns at the top that can help you quickly navigate. So there's quite a few different ways that make it a lot easier to navigate like large code files or large code bases. And then our integrated terminal. With Visual Studio, you already have an integrated terminal that can help you execute commands, use version control, or run scripts without ever leaving the IDE. We've also added custom integrated Synergy terminal that provides not only like the Visual Studio command support, but also support for Synergy commands with the environment actually loaded from whatever project you have selected in the Solution Explorer. So it'll pull in all your common props and environment variables from that project and let you quickly run commands through the command line. This next slide is ultimately about how we have tailored Visual Studio for Synergy DBL. It's really been design that has been from the ground up with Synergy in mind. This means it's not just a mere add-on, but a deeply integrated solution, ensuring that Synergy developers get the most out of Visual Studio. We have prepared functional project templates to capture common use cases as shown in the image on the left. The right image shows a basic example of debugging a fresh Synergy.NET console application, where you can step through the code and you can view the local variables and call stack information using an interactive UI. Our understanding of Synergy has led us to introduce features that resonate specifically with Synergy developers. Whether it's specialized debugging tools, enhanced IntelliSense for Synergy code, or specific build optimizations, SDI ensures that the Synergy development process is as smooth as possible. We also provide dedicated support. Our team comprises of experts who understand both the intricacies of Visual Studio and the nuances of Synergy. This ensures that when you face challenges, you're getting guidance from those who truly understand. We prioritize feedback, whether it's a feature request, a bug report, or a usability suggestion. Our team is on it, making sure that SDI always aligns with developers' needs. And we try to stay up to date. Just as Visual Studio continues to introduce innovative features, often very quickly, SDI isn't left behind. We ensure that any new capability in Visual Studio that can benefit Synergy developers is quickly integrated into SDI. Our development cycle is in sync with Visual Studio's. This ensures that when a new Visual Studio update rolls out, an SDI update isn't far behind. Often we're testing as a preview and we are ready to go for the general release. And these SDI updates maintain compatibility and introduce new features. The tech world evolves rapidly. Our commitment is to ensure that Synergy developers via SDI always have access to modern tools, keeping them competitive and efficient. Now that's it for my section here. Let's go back to Dan so he can go more into detail on what a Visual Studio migration could look like, and then I'll come back for the roadmap.
Thanks, Tim. So I'd like to share my experiences now creating Visual Studio solutions for some of our PSG customers. I've done 5 over the last few years, so I've learned quite a lot over the course of doing that, and I'd like to share that with you. One of the things that I've sometimes just talking to customers about, they've thought that actually getting to Visual Studio is quite a task, quite time-consuming and fraught with problems. But I've kept honing my process over the course of these conversions, and I've found that it's actually not as bad as you think it is. In some cases, you can get to a fully working Visual Studio solution within a couple of weeks, depending on the state of your source code. So the first thing I want to talk about are the prerequisites and things that you need to think about before you start the project. Obviously, the first thing that you need is a Synergy install. Visual Studio, the supported version that we have, only works on Windows. So you need a Synergy Windows Synergy install, preferably Synergy 12. You also need a copy of Visual Studio, and there are several different ways to get this and license it. You can go with Visual Studio Community if you're a non-profit or if you're a small organization. You can go with Professional, or you can go with the Enterprise version. You can buy Visual Studio outright if you want, or you can get an MSDN subscription, usually around $45 a month, to get Visual Studio Professional. And obviously that includes you to all of the updates, and they do update Visual Studio a lot. I think that's one of the SDI team's headaches, is keeping up with all of the changes to Visual Studio. Currently, we're supporting Visual Studio 2022. We recently deprecated our support for 2019 in preparing for the newer version of Visual Studio. So at the moment, 2022 is where you want to be. And obviously, you'll also need to install our Visual Studio Synergy Integration, the SDI product. Once you've got that, you've got all the extensions. You can create Synergy projects, you can create solutions, you can create repository projects, script projects, all that kind of stuff. That's all been covered in previous videos. So I'm just going to concentrate on some of the things that you need to think about when you do these kind of projects. So the first thing you need to consider is what you're going to do with your source and your source tree. by default, if you make a new Synergy project and you start adding source to your project, it'll actually create a copy of that source and it'll pull it into the Visual Studio project source directory. And sometimes that isn't what you want. For instance, on one of our projects, we had one developer who was close to retirement, and he wanted to keep editing the source code on Vi. So what we did was we kept the existing source code structure. So, there are about 6 or 7 directories, one directory for includes, one directory for repository structures, one directory for toolkit scripts. So we kept that structure, and we actually did add existing reference when we was pulling the source code into Visual Studio. So that actually didn't copy it, and it left the source code in the location, obviously relative to where the Visual Studio solution is, but it left it in the same directory structure. So that enabled the people that were going to develop with Visual Studio to use that directory structure, but it enabled our Vi developer to keep working on the same with the same structure as well. That's also important if you're using something, if you're on OpenVMS and you're going to use a sync program to sync up the source on Windows with the source on VMS that you're then going to build on VMS. So keeping that directory structure the same, I find is quite often really valuable. The other thing you need to consider is what source control you're going to use. There are lots of really good plugins for Visual Studio. So if you already use something like SVN, you can get the SVN plugin for Visual Studio, and you can use your existing SVN repositories. All the projects that I've done for customers that didn't have existing source control. So we've used a flavor of Git, either from GitHub, a cloud provider, or from Microsoft Azure DevOps. And I've covered the migration to DevOps in a previous webinar for those of you who are interested. Just one other thing about the downside to if you're going to keep the same directory structure for your source is that when you do add new source to Visual Studio, it is going to pull it in. It is going to create it in the Visual Studio project directory, which is probably not where you want it. So if you are using that mechanism, you're going to have to then manually copy the new file from the Visual Studio directory to the existing source directory and re-reference it from Visual Studio. So that's just one thing to consider about that. So what are some things to know about doing Visual Studio solution? So the first thing to stress is that the effort to move will vary depending on the state of your source code files. If you already have a build, you can build your product from scratch. This is going to make it a whole lot easier. And to say, I've come into a customer who already had a shell script or a batch file or even a workbench solution, I've been able to get them up and running in less than 2 weeks. It may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but often an older source is easier to bring into Visual Studio because it does less complex things. And everything in traditional Synergy is supported. So you quite often, other than the things I'm going to talk about shortly, we'll find very few issues. I've worked on some systems where there's actually a script file to build a program that copies source code, 3 or 4 different source code artifacts together to make a single piece of source code. Those kind of things are harder to do within Visual Studio. They are doable, but they are harder to do. But if you already have a batch file or a shell script where you can build it, this will make it a lot easier. The second thing to state, which I think is probably obvious as well, is when you start building in VS, it's going to find issues, and that's good. It's going to prototype all of your code. And I'm going to mention a couple of things later on about how to overcome these issues. So again, source control is strongly recommended. It will be a bit of a waste of effort if you went ahead and did a Visual Studio solution, which would then mean that people will be working on their own machines for development to not have source control, because your effort to merge the code back manually would be silly. So and obviously we can help you do your move. If you're on VMS, one interesting thing to note, I think we've mentioned it before, is we have a VMS stubs library. So if you have a whole load of sort of traditional Synergy source code that references sys this and all kinds of VMS libraries, we have some stubs to make it compile. So that VMS library stub. Another thing to bear in mind as well is that we do have a project to migrate a Workbench project to a Visual Studio solution and to do its best job of making a Visual Studio solution. Again, a little bit counterintuitive, but the older the Workbench project, actually the better job it's going to do of doing a migration to Visual Studio. One of the other key things about making a Visual Studio solution is that you're actually isolating your build environment. So by creating a Visual Studio build, you will create the ability to make a version of your system local to a developer's PC. And what that means is you can actually then make other environments, for instance, for a QA scenario or a development testing machine. If you need a machine that's got all of the data and all of the third-party APIs that you need, it's much easier to deploy a whole system build to those environments. And obviously, it goes without saying, it's a lot easier for remote working. Obviously, most of us in PSG, we are remote workers. So we can just clone the Visual Studio solution onto our laptops, do our work, and then commit our changes to a cloud based Git implementation usually, which then other developers in other parts of the world can take our changes and merge them in with theirs or test how they're going to work in relation to theirs as well. So the key thing is you will now be able to have an isolated version of your software. What you also get by making a Visual Studio solution is you get an MS Build instance of your solution as well. So you can use the MS Build subsystem to actually build your traditional Synergy project. So more advanced things are that you can then, when you check your code into, for instance, Azure DevOps, you can then trigger off a build actually in DevOps to build your traditional Synergy application. And as part of that build that you can do in DevOps, you can, if the build fails, so somebody's checked in some code, some bad code, you can reject that commit. So you can do like a gated commit within there. But what you can also do is you can automatically deploy that when the build's finished to, for instance, a QA machine for test. And you can also run a bunch of unit tests on it as well. So by having a Visual Studio solution, you also gain an MS Build solution and the ability to use that MS Build solution within the Azure DevOps environment. There are other ways of doing it within DevOps. It will run batch files and those kind of stuff, but it's much more aware of what MS Build is doing. So another sort of plus point for this approach. Okay, so let's talk about the process that I use for creating a new Visual Studio solution. And just to note that this is for a traditional Synergy project only. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll create the new solution file, and I'll start with the ELBs. So most soft Synergy applications have a set of foundation subroutines. Usually, quite often it's one ELB, sometimes it's multiple ELBs. So I'll start off with making the foundation ELB Synergy project. So within Visual Studio, you can go into make a new Synergy ELB project or OLB project, and then start adding the source code files. I'll usually add the source code files sort of 5 or 10 at a time. I won't add the whole directory because sometimes the error list can be a bit overwhelming. So I'll start adding them sort of 5 source code files at a time. Compile, make sure they compile. If not, solve any errors. And also what I'm doing at that time is I'm adding any environment variables that I need for things like for include directories as well. So I'll add the common properties within there as I go along if I don't already have a list of existing common properties. Quite often, software solutions don't have a list of all of the common properties that they need to build. So I'll go ahead and I'll do that, and I'll make the ELB projects for the foundations. I'll turn off link checking so that it's not going to try and validate that all of the subroutines are there. I won't switch that on until I've finished, just to make sure that I have got everything that it links against. So once I've got my foundation projects in there and compiled, I'll create a number of solution item projects. So solution item projects are kind of these are projects within Visual Studio that don't compile. They're just sort of like a placeholder to put things. So, for instance, I'll put any include files within there, because obviously you don't want the include files to be compiled. If there are any sort of shell scripts within there, any other artifacts, I'll put those within. I'll create a shell script solution item project and put those within there as well. And any other artifacts. Quite often I'll make a README solution items as well. I can put notes in. And the nice thing about this is they'll be shared with other developers who clone that Visual Studio project. So as I mentioned, as I go along, I'll be creating common properties. I'll always use relative paths for those relative to the base solution dir. So when somebody else clones it, they all point to the right place. And then once I've got that working, I'll iterate through all of the other projects and start creating those. So if there's a repository part of this, I'll create a separate repository project. Again, start including the schema files. Quite often, traditional projects that haven't had source code control before don't have schema files. So one thing that I'll have to do is dump the schema files from the RPS min and RPS text files and include those in a repository project to make sure I can get that compiled. If it's toolkit, I'll add a toolkit script project, get that compiled, and then I'll add a multiple mainline project. And depending on how the application is structured, sometimes I'll have a multiple mainline project for the AP programs, particularly if they're all in a separate directory, and then the GL programs, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes it just makes sense to put everything into a single program file directory. And I'll just iterate through adding 5 or 10 programs at a time to the solution, making sure they compile before adding the next ones. And then when I'm finished with that, I'll start looking at if the project actually works. Okay, let's talk about some common issues that you'll come across. By far, the most common issue you'll have are type mismatches. So this is usually where you're passing an alpha parameter into a decimal, or passing a decimal into an alpha. And I found this is really, really common on traditional Synergy code, particularly older code. Now, with all of these issues, it's good to look at the root cause of this and see if you can fix the issue, because there may be a bug that you've had for 30 years that may be caused by a type mismatch. But generally, you just want the code to work the way it did before, because you're satisfied that the code is working for the most part. So the easiest way to get them to work like they did before is by, if you're sending an alpha into a decimal, is to set QRelaxed within Visual Studio, the QRelaxed compiler switch. You may also need to do this if you've got some particularly old source syntax, which maybe is not supported. You can turn on the end qualifier as one of them. If you're passing a decimal into an alpha, then you may want to use the mismatch parameter within the subroutine. And again, those will make the code work the way it worked before. And they will, in my experience, get you around about 90% of the issues that you'll have when you create a Visual Studio solution. Another one that I come across a lot is the wrong number of parameters being passed into a subroutine. So i.e. you're actually passing more parameters into a subroutine than the subroutine supports, and that will get picked up by Visual Studio. So most of the time it's because you've deprecated some parameters, but you didn't change the source code that called it. So you can either fix the source code to not send those parameters after obviously you've investigated that it isn't a bug, or you can just add some additional null parameters to the subroutine. Another common thing that I find, particularly for those systems that don't have a build shell script or batch file, is that they'll have subroutine names that are the same. And sometimes the code is different. So they'll have multiple DBL source files, all with the same subroutine name. So obviously the best way to sort it is to merge the subroutines all into one if it's possible, if it's not too complicated. Alternatively, if you know which subroutine goes with which DBL mainline, you can change the subroutine name. I usually put the name of the mainline that it's calling at the end of the subroutine name, and then change the mainline to call it with the additional with the new subroutine name on. And from those, that will get you through most of the issues that you find. Particularly if you're mostly passing alphas into decimals, you can set Q relaxed, and it will allow you to compile your solution. You can then test it, make sure that it works the way that it did before, and then decide if you actually want to fix the type mismatches properly by using the right types, or if you're happy to let that code be deployed in the way that it already is. So just to share some customer examples on my recent projects, I did one project for a customer that using AIX, a big corporate customer. They had a retiring developer who had used VI all of his life and wanted to continue using VI, but they were bringing in new developers who wanted to use Visual Studio because A, that was what they were familiar with, and B, it was much easier to read and work with unfamiliar code using Visual Studio. They also wanted to move to DevOps because that aligned with the way the rest of the business was working. So that was what I was saying about deciding whether you want to use the existing directory structure or whether you want to pull the code into a new Visual Studio project. Because the customer was on AIX, we were not able to directly build for that platform from Visual Studio. So we did have to create a separate set of shell scripts to build the system. It worked pretty well. You can make all of your changes on Visual Studio, commit them to GitHub, DevOps in our case, and then on the AIX side, just do a git pull, and it'll pull all of your changes into AIX, and then you can just run the shell scripts to build it. So we created a shared area for people to test and to do QA with it on the AIX system. So the retiring developer was able to do all of his development using VI. He would then do a git commit from the command line on AIX when he tested it and wanted to commit his changes, while the rest of the team could just do all of their work on Visual Studio, do their commits, then do a git pull on AIX, deal with any conflicts if there were any, and test away. So that worked really well, and we were able to actually bring that customer sort of into alignment with the rest of the business. Previously, they thought, well, the Synergy system is a bit of a legacy system, and moving people in and out of that team will be difficult. But now, obviously, by doing that, it's much more familiar to everybody else, to all of the other developers within that company. Another project I did was, again, for a customer who had a retiring developer. This time, this customer was on Linux. They had no build or QA environment. So testing on the system, all of the testing had to be done in production, which was obviously not ideal. And they were looking, obviously, to bring a new developer in to replace that retiring developer. So the hardest one for that was that because they had no build files for it, it was what I like to describe as a little bit of code archaeology. I had to find out how the code was built from scratch, and that took a little bit longer. I will admit, I think it took me about a month to get that up and running. But obviously, I was unfamiliar with the system and the libraries that it made, and that was one where there were lots of subroutines, all with the same name, but different subroutines were linked against different DBRs. So that was quite an interesting challenge to get that working. But we did get that working. As I say, it took about a month. And one of the key takeaways from that one is that we were able to build a development and a QA environment. And we've actually come in as PSG. Well, actually not PSG, but Synergex application support. And we're actually supporting and developing for that Linux customer. So it was much easier for us to come in. We know Visual Studio, we don't know the code base, but to be up and running really quickly. And because we've got a development and QA server, we can deploy to both of those environments, do our testing with test data, and then push it to the QA environment for the customer themselves to be able to test the changes that we've done without worrying about putting changes into production or having to test things when they go to production. So those were two really successful projects that we did for our customers. And just lastly from me, a little bit of a plug. We've recently collaborated with one of our customers, Sheet Metal Connectors, who again have a retiring developer. They were a Windows customer, and they brought PSG on to do a Visual Studio migration for them. And we've written a whole case study about it, so we'll put a link in the slides. But go and have a look at that if you want some more details. What some of the challenges were, what some of the takeaways were, and the reasons why Sheet Metal Connectors decided to do that. And one of the best things from that is the fact that they had previously hired somebody to come in and take over from their retiring developer, but they were working in Notepad, and they had no build. It was a fairly basic development environment. So that developer actually left after a few months and said, "No, I can't put up with this no more. I'm off." And actually, after I'd done the Visual Studio migration for them, they rehired that developer, and he is now doing work for them, and he's much happier with his Visual Studio solution. So that was the biggest sort of success story for me, was actually being able to bring a new developer into the Synergy fold and have them be happy with the environment that they were provided with. So that's just a few things for me about my experiences of moving to Visual Studio. Hopefully you will see that it is actually in many cases easier than you think. Of course, we can help you get there too, but there are plenty of resources available. We've done plenty of YouTube videos before, and as I say, have a look at the case study. So with that, I'll hand back to Tim. Thanks.
All right, I'm back for the SDI product updates. So I'll start off with what's new and what's upcoming in the near future, and then also what some of our future roadmap could look like. So currently, we added support for Linux and .NET 6 Plus within Visual Studio. This is an ongoing effort on our part. So we have the support in place. The one area with .NET compared to .NET Framework as the predecessor. Microsoft has made some major changes as far as like the project system. So you can see towards the bottom here, and upcoming, we're looking at improving our project system by moving from NPF into the common project system. Most other languages have already moved from NPF to the common project system that are extensions, but we're planning to do the same as well. And that'll end up giving us better stability, especially on the .NET 6 Plus side, as well as better performance and more maintainability for the future. So that's one area we are looking at in the upcoming future. For developer support, there's a robust collaboration between developer support, the developer support team, and the dev team for SDI, where we ensure swift resolution of obstacles. Cases get quickly escalated to us. We get quickly involved. We like to work back and forth with customers. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. So yeah, the strong synergy also between the PSG and the dev teams further enhances the product quality. So we try to work closely with different PSG solution architects and get a better feel for what pain points are to assist with SDI migrations, like Dan has mentioned. Our goal is to make everything as streamlined as possible. And one way to do that is through metrics and analysis. So we've had a renewed focus in the last year or so on improving our metrics and our analysis so we can better focus on what's going to give us the most value for our time and give you ultimately the most value from our effort. So as part of that, we've introduced telemetry, and this is to look at diagnostic cases. So there's many cases where there's bugs that are difficult to track down because they're intermittent or we're just not able to normally reproduce them. But now, not only does this enhance our internal QA testing, but it lets us catch these issues before they impact a customer. So we'll do like early releases of our builds, and we can get that feedback from users that, oh, there's this intermittent exception, and now we have a stack trace, and we can correct that before we generally release. So it's helped us catch a lot of those issues proactively and overall improve our quality. Same, a little bit of user analytics as well. If you opt in to the telemetry and SDI. And again, we anonymize everything. We're actually working on some documentation to show like what kind of data we collect and why and what the benefits have been. So we want to have full transparency here with what we're collecting. And our main focus has been just like different events, like for example, different project loads, like are people using WPF and WinForms, which our data shows that many people are not using WPF and WinForms. So we've been looking at deprecating support so we could better focus on like .NET stability, for example, or some of the future enhancements. Same idea with performance metrics. We've been looking at performance profiling, like our large editor performance, compiler performance. In general cases, the telemetry also collects some performance metrics. And this helps us better get a feel for what kind of improvements we're making, if we're progressing over time, if there's been any backsliding, we can catch that and address it early. So we've been trying to add more data so we can really get those better results for everyone. And that also ties into Visual Studio resilience. So one of our challenges is Microsoft continuously adds new features to Visual Studio. They change things out from under us just because they have a very large team and they're just continuously adding new things. And our goal is to keep up to date with that and actually provide the best quality and ensure that there's no breaking changes on a USDI version update. So as part of the Visual Studio resilience, we're renewing our focus on the latest version of Visual Studio. So for us right now, that is Visual Studio 2022. We've deprecated Visual Studio 2019 support so we can better focus on improving the resilience and quality of Visual Studio 2022. And that's for 17.4 and above currently. And ultimately, it's just to ensure a smoother user experience where when you can feel safe to hit that update button in Visual Studio and trust that SDI is not going to catastrophically fall over. And then some of the considerations for the future. We're looking at adding .NET multiple mainline. So right now we have multiple mainline for traditional, and that, as I mentioned earlier, makes it easy for people that have a lot of different DPRs or a lot of different binaries that they just want to put into a Visual Studio solution as quickly as possible. They don't want to create a bunch of projects for every single DBR. The easiest way is to use a multiple mainline, so you can have multiple mainlines within a single project within Visual Studio, and that lets you build all those DBRs from one project and not have to do as much configuration to move over. So if you're on the edge, it makes it a lot easier. But our goal is to not just do that in traditional, but to do that in .NET. So we also are more user friendly, where we can support people that are more comfortable developing in .NET or extending functionality within .NET. They can end up using the .NET here, and that also harmonizes with Harmony Core. So a common piece of feedback that we get is around the compiler performance. And now making any improvements here would benefit not just SDI users, but anyone that needs to build or use the compiler. SDI heavily relies on the compiler. We use it for like our IntelliSense generation. When you load a project, we do like a background compile, and that ends up generating all the symbols we need to load IntelliSense, essentially. So it would improve that project load. It would improve the IntelliSense responsiveness. It would improve the build times. And this is something we're already starting to look at with the metrics and analysis that we've put in. It's also something that the compiler team, which we're now working even more closely with, has been focusing on, as far as like they've already been looking at like replacing the COM API for .NET, and in doing so, profiling that and seeing what they can do to improve like metadata loading. And from here, they're going to be continuously looking at what they can do to improve performance across the board in both the traditional and .NET compilers. For repository enhancements, this is another area that we've gotten a lot of feedback. So one area here is the repository schema IntelliSense. So we want to explore like schema editing within Visual Studio and actually have like good IntelliSense that can make it friendly to use. One way we've been looking at that is perhaps a language server protocol, and that could even enhance our Visual Studio Code extension that I mentioned earlier, where we currently just have colorization, but if we can build some support in it for IntelliSense with language server protocol, it would enable us to add that same IntelliSense support to pretty much any IDE that supports this protocol. Unfortunately, just updating the schema for IntelliSense isn't quite enough. Like we'd want to also introduce some snippets for new items such as structures, fields, whatever you need within that IntelliSense. But even if you're able to generate snippets and edit the schema using IntelliSense within Visual Studio, you still want to work nicely with the RPS util. So part of that is like improving the actual repository tooling to export in a way that provides more capabilities and enables this sort of hybrid approach where you can work in both the RPS utility, or you can go and work in Visual Studio and do some schema IntelliSense editing. So we want to facilitate exporting to individual schemas and handling any deltas made within the repository actual UI. So same idea here. We want to also make some user interface improvements to the repository UI to enable direct editing of specific structures, files, whatever you need. So part of these repository enhancements would be both in the repository tooling and then also within Visual Studio and the schema files. More to come on that. These are more like considerations for the future, a little bit farther out on the roadmap. Our big focus right now is really to improve our baseline, to get to a spot where we can focus on the most valuable things, especially the .NET support is a major focus for us. And then also getting to a spot where we have more resiliency for Visual Studio updates for our project system, and improving the people's experience overall, and just providing more quality and easing STI migrations. So that's our main focus right now. And in the future, we want to add these nice flashing new features, and any other ideas that come up. If you want to post an idea, feel free to either reach out to support, reach out to my team, or reach out on the resource center ideas. But first, we want to really get to a good baseline. And then from there, we can have much more productivity as we add new features and make sure we're doing it in a way that's data-driven. Thank you, everyone. That's the SDI product update. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback for me or my team, or anything we can do to help you, feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to help you. Thank you.
So thanks so much to Tim and Dan for that great presentation. And also just a big thank you to Sheet Metal Connectors for participating in that case study with us. Our education team has just posted the link to that case study. So I hope you guys can take a look. And we are now going to enter into the Q&A portion of this. So we've got some questions that we gathered beforehand in case we didn't get a ton of chats here in the live webinar. So while we're waiting for people to type out any questions here, I'm going to ask some of these. So this one is, I think either of you guys could take this. Are there any other considerations for Visual Studio development on OpenVMS?
I'll take that one if you want, because I've done an OpenVMS Visual Studio project. Yeah, and the experience should be improved now. But the key issue with VMS is that we can't do a VMS build in Visual Studio. If you're working on Linux, you can basically build a Linux executable, Linux DBRs and ELBs straight from Visual Studio onto your Linux machine. But for VMS, you can't. So in the past, we've used things like FileZilla to sync up the user's laptop with the VMS, with the source directories in VMS. Or we have our own open source thing that Jeff worked on ages ago. Or we've used Azure DevOps. We have one customer, I didn't set it up, but one customer actually does the build in Azure DevOps and then uses the scripting capabilities within DevOps to copy the files to OpenVMS and then build them on VMS. And they actually do a gated build as well. So if the build fails, it rejects the commit. But I haven't done it myself, but I'm told that these days VSI actually ships with a Git client. So you can have a similar experience to the one that I mentioned with the IX, where you can commit your code to your cloud Git provider, and then from VMS you'll just be able to do a Git sync, a Git pull, sorry, or a Git clone, and be able to pull your changes straight from the cloud and build them on VMS. So as I said, I haven't tried it myself, but I have it on good authority that it's a pretty good Git implementation. So that should make a pretty seamless experience for OpenVMS developers. And then obviously one thing that I forgot to mention during my presentation is that you can remote debug as well. So you can start off a debug session on VMS or AIX, as we do for our AIX customer, and use the Visual Studio debugger on your laptop to step through line by line if you prefer to use a Visual Studio debugger as well. So that gives you a really good experience as well.
Tim, did you have anything to add to that one?
I think Dan covered that pretty well. Thank you, Dan.
Perfect. Okay, so the next question is, how frequently does the SDI extension receive updates in sync with Visual Studio?
I can take
seems
that
like
one.
a fun question. Yeah.
So as both of us mentioned, Visual Studio updates very frequently. Microsoft's continuously making new changes, and part of that is it follows their release channels and their release rhythm. So I'm going to go ahead and provide a link here in the chat that goes over what that release rhythm looks like. But essentially, each of the even minor version releases for Visual Studio, like 17.0, 17.2, 17.4, end up having an 18-month LTS channel. So Microsoft continues to provide support for those channels, and we end up supporting usually the lowest one. In this case, we're supporting a minimum of 17.4 and above. So we try to keep up to date from everything above that LTS channel up to the latest release that is generally available. And to do so, we're constantly testing as the preview and trying to time our SDI releases with the preview. So I'm providing some links here in the chat, both our downloads page and what Visual Studio does for their release cadence. And if you look at our downloads and you go to the SDI section, or maybe look at the release log, you'll see that we tend to release roughly monthly, but we try to time those with those Visual Studio releases. So by testing against the preview and then timing it so we support anything that Microsoft changes. So that's just a high level view of what to look at. And I recommend taking a closer look at that Microsoft link so you can see how they actually plan out their Visual Studio releases.
Thanks, Tim. And I think that the final question that we had prepared ahead of time is, what resources are available for developers to learn more about Visual Studio and SDI?
Another good question here. So I'll provide one more link here of Microsoft's Visual Studio documentation. So if you come into the chat, you can take a look at the documentation that Visual Studio provides. And this goes over a high-level view of all the features, some of the ones I talked about today and more that are available. And then I also recommend taking a look at the Synergex documentation. We have an SDI section, so under Synergy and Visual Studio. So I'll go ahead and link that as well.
I think our YouTube channel has lots of really good videos on how to do it. I think I learned how to do it from our YouTube channel. So way back when.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Tim. And that wraps up our Q&A at this point. And if anybody has any additional questions or wants to learn more or have a conversation with us about how this might work for your organization, please do not hesitate to reach out. Have a wonderful rest of your days. And thanks so much for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thanks. I hope it's encouraged. I hope it's encouraged some people to just have a go and try and make a Visual Studio solution. As I say, it is easier than you think.
And reach out if you need any help. We're here to help.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.